Hey y'all, welcome to the Harold Robinson analysis. If you have ever looked around at everything going on in this country and thought, none of this makes sense, you're not alone. A lot of people feel like the system is something that's happening to them instead of something that they are a part of. Prices go up, jobs change, headlines shift every hour, and every group points a bigger finger at someone else. One side blames the president, the other side blames the last president. People shout about inflation, recessions, big corporations, Wall Street, Congress, taxes, and debt. And most of the time, the explanations sound like they are missing something. Here is a truth that almost no one takes the time to explain. Power in the United States is distributed. It flows through multiple institutions. It is not simple, and it is not visible at first glance. We are told that the president controls the economy. We are told that a single election can fix everything. We are told that good times or bad times come from the person that's sitting behind the resolute desk. But the real architecture of American economic power is much more complex. There is a central bank adjusting the price of money itself. There is a Congress deciding how trillions of dollars are taxed and spent. There's a Treasury Department managing the trust that the world places in the United States. These are corporations making decisions that determine whether towns grow or whether they shrink. There are media and tech platforms shaping what people believe about the future. And there's a massive administrative system executing laws, enforcing rules, and influencing outcomes from behind the scenes. These forces together shape the world you live in every single day. Yet, most people never learn how the system actually works. This show is here to change that. Every week, we will look at one piece of U.S. governance and economics and break it down clearly, without spin, without slogans, and without trying to push you into a political corner. Because the moment you understand how the system works, it becomes harder for anyone to take advantage of confusion or fear. Tonight is episode one, and we are beginning with the biggest misconception in American public life. Who actually runs the U.S. economy? The answer is not as simple as one name or one office. It requires peeling back layers that most headlines never discuss. So let's do that together. Hey, y'all. This is the Harold Robinson analysis. Let's get into it. Let's start with the belief most Americans have grown up with, the idea that the President of the United States is the one person who controls the economy. If prices go up, blame the President. If jobs are created, praise the President. If the stock market rises or falls, people react based on who sits in the Oval Office. It feels natural. The president is the most visible figure in American life. A single person, a single name, one decision maker who seems to be in charge of everything. But perception and reality are not always the same thing. Every election season, you hear promises that sound like direct control. Candidates promise to create millions of jobs, lower the price of gas, fix the housing market, and get inflation under control. They make these promises because that is what voters want to hear. We want to believe that the president can just fix things. We want the person in the White House to grab the steering wheel of the entire economy and turn hard left or hard right, past solutions to complex problems. And when they cannot deliver those fast results, we feel betrayed. The truth is that the president is not the manager of the U.S. economy. The president has influence but not operational control. The president can set priorities and sign laws. The president can appoint advisors and heads of agencies who help shape regulation. The president can meet with business leaders and push for cooperation. The president can make speeches that encourage or discourage investment, depending on confidence. However, none of those actions directly move the deepest levers of economic power. The president does not decide how much money exists in the system. The president does not set interest rates. The president does not tell banks how much to lend or consumers how much to spend. Those controls lie elsewhere, often in institutions that have no ballot box attached to them. This creates a powerful illusion. It looks like the president is steering the ship, when in reality, many others have their hands on the wheel. There is also a psychological layer to the illusion. Humans prefer simple explanations. We want heroes to greet when times are good. We want villains to blame when times are bad. Pointing to Congress or the Federal Reserve or multinational corporations requires understanding systems. Systems are complicated. People don't chant systems at rallies, they chant names. So we turn to the president as a symbol of success or failure. News media reinforces this dynamic every single day. They cover every word the president speaks about the economy because it drives ratings. Elections become referendum battles on who can fix the economy faster. Pundits talk like every small movement in the stock market is a direct response to whatever the president just said. It becomes a narrative, a simplified story that removes complexity so the audience can follow along without needing to learn every detail. But simplified stories are not the same as the truth. There is another reason why the illusion is so strong. The president leads the executive branch, and within that branch are federal agencies that have significant influence over the economy. Agencies write rules that impact businesses, markets, and workers. So it feels like the president controls the economy through those agencies. Yet, even here, internal processes, legal limits, and Congress's authority shape what those agencies are allowed to do. Any economic policy that requires spending money must go through Congress. Any regulatory design can be challenged in the courts. Any executive order may be undone by the next administration. That is not the structure of a king. That is the structure of distributed authority. Still, the illusion persists for one more reason. It benefits almost every political actor involved. Opponents of the president want voters to believe everything bad is the president's fault. Supporters want voters to believe everything good comes from the president's leadership. Campaign strategists on all sides build emotional persuasion around the president's supposed total control. It is a game of assigning credit and blame, not a lesson in economic architecture. This illusion has consequences. When citizens misunderstand who is responsible, they misdirect their anger, their expectations, and their votes. They might demand a president fix inflation, when inflation is being driven largely by monetary policy and global supply chains. They might demand a president create jobs, when hiring depends more on business risk and assessments and interest rates than executive speeches. They might vote for someone based on promises no president could ever realistically fulfill. The more people misunderstand the system, the easier it becomes for powerful institutions to operate without accountability. When the spotlight is pointed at the wrong place, those truly making the decisions can act with less resistance. And that weakens the role of informed citizenship in a democracy. Now, none of this means that the president does not matter. The president has real influence through leadership, communication, and the appointment of key officials. The president can shape the direction of policy. The president commands national attention, but influence is not control. Influence is not operational power. Presidents often react to economic conditions rather than create them. They inherit momentum from years of decisions made by Congress, the Federal Reserve, corporations, and global markets. A president may enter office during a boom and leave during a downturn, or the reverse, without personally causing either outcome. Yet, the historical story that gets written about them usually credits or blames them anyway. There's also timing. Economic policies often take years to show results. By the time a policy helps the economy grow, a different president might be in office, so credit goes to the wrong person. And when a president does something harmful, the effects might not hit until long after they have left. So blame is misplaced. This disconnect between cause and effect fuels the illusion even more. If we want to truly understand the American economy, we have to step away from instinct to view the president as a single source of economic success or failure. We have to examine the system as it's actually designed, a network of power shared across institutions that operate according to different interests and incentives. So the first step is recognizing the illusion of presidential power. Once we clear that illusion away, we can start asking the right questions. If not the president, then who? Who sets the policies that move our money? Who shapes prices and wages? Who influences whether businesses invest or hold back? Who determines whether borrowing is cheap or expensive? Who decides how much our government spends and what it spends on? Those questions lead us deeper into the architecture of American power. And in the next parts of this episode, we're going to look at each institution that plays a major role: the Federal Reserve, Congress, the Treasury, major corporations, media, and technology platforms, and the administrative agencies that implement the rules. Understanding this system gives us a much clearer picture of how economic decisions are made and who we should hold accountable when things go wrong. Now that we have cleared away the illusion of presidential control, we can talk about where the deepest levers of economic power actually live. The first and most central institution in that system is the Federal Reserve. If the president is the face of the economy, the Federal Reserve is the operating heart. It keeps the blood flowing, regulates the pulse, and applies pressure when the system becomes unstoppable. Yet for most Americans, the Federal Reserve is almost a ghost. It exists in the background, silent and unvoted upon, influencing the cost of living every day. The Federal Reserve, often called the Fed, is a central bank of the United States. Central banks exist in many countries, but the Federal Reserve is one of the most powerful in the world because of the size of the U.S. economy and the global role of the U.S. dollar. The Fed was created in 1913 after a series of financial crises that showed that the country needed a stabilizing institution that can manage the money supply and ensure the soundness of banks. It was built to keep the financial system from collapsing under pressure, whether during a panic, a recession, or a war. Now, what does the Federal Reserve actually do? Most people hear about interest rates. When inflation gets too high, the Fed raises taxes. When the economy slows down, the Fed lowers them. In simple terms, interest rates are the price of borrowing money. When money is cheap, people and businesses borrow more. When they buy houses, expand companies, and spend more freely, this increases economic growth. But if borrowing is too cheap for too long, spending increases faster than supply and prices rise. That is inflation. On the other hand, when interest rates rise, borrowing becomes more expensive. Mortgages go up, car loans go up, credit card payments go up, business loans become riskier. All of that slows down spending and investment, which helps cool inflation. So, in the fight between inflation and recession, the Federal Reserve is constantly adjusting to the pressure, like turning a valve one direction to speed the economy up or the other direction to slow it down. The Fed also controls the amount of money circulating in the economy. It does this by buying and selling government bonds, lending to the banks, and adjusting regulations that affect lending practices. These actions may seem technical, but they impact whether households feel financially comfortable or financially squeezed. Now, here is the remarkable thing: citizens do not vote for these officials. Federal Reserve leaders are appointed, and once they are in place, they are given a degree of independence that removes them from the direct influence of election year politics. The idea behind the independence is simple. If politicians control the creation of money and credit, the temptation to manipulate the economy for electoral gain would be overwhelming. Leaders might try to boost growth artificially, right before an election, and ignore the long term consequences. The founders feared kings. The designers of the Federal Reserve feared reckless elected officials steering the economy off a cliff to win votes. This independence means the Federal Reserve does not always act in a way that is politically convenient. Sometimes the Fed raises interest rates, even when presidents and members of Congress would prefer that the rates stay low. Sometimes the Fed slows the economy down to prevent overheating, even if it makes the sitting administration look bad. And the Fed takes action that causes job growth to slow or borrowing to become more expensive. So people blame the president instead. That is the illusion we talked about earlier. The president is the face of economic pain when the Federal Reserve is the source of all economic pressure. The Fed's decisions affect every single person listening to this right now. Whether you're trying to buy a home, get a loan, or build a small business, the Federal Reserve stands between you and your financial hopes. It may not feel like a direct relationship, but it is. Many Americans live in a country shaped by an institution they rarely think about and never get to vote for. Why is that politically acceptable? Because the Federal Reserve's power is justified by its expertise. Monetary policy is complex. It requires deep analysis, long term planning, and a steady hand. Now, in theory, experts should handle these decisions instead of politicians who are focused on the next election. In practice, however, this creates a disconnect. The institution with the most influence over daily economic life is one step removed from accountability. Most Americans do not know what the Fed is doing, they only feel the results. Now, let us talk about times of crisis. When the economy collapses or faces major shocks, the Federal Reserve often steps in as the first responder. In 2008, during a financial crash, the Federal Reserve injected money into the banking system to prevent total collapse. In 2020, during a pandemic, it did the same on an even larger scale. These actions saved the system from disaster, but they also expanded the Fed's influence and raised questions about the limits of its authority. When one institution becomes responsible for stabilizing the entire economy, its decisions carry consequences far beyond the banking world. The Federal Reserve has two primary roles, known as the dual mandate: maximum employment and stable prices. In reality, these goals are often in tension. Policies that reduce unemployment can push inflation higher. Policies that control inflation can raise unemployment. The Federal Reserve's challenge is to find the balance. And in that balancing act, winners and losers emerge. Some people will find work, others may lose it. Some prices stabilize, others become less affordable. When the Fed shifts interest rates, it's making trade offs that affect real families and real businesses. Another part of the Federal Reserve System includes the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks scattered across the country. They gather economic data from their regions and provide feedback on conditions at the local level. This structure ties to prevent the entire system from being focused slowly on Wall Street and government offices in Washington. So it's a recognition that the US economy is not one thing. It is an interconnected web of regional markets. But even with this design, critics argue that the Federal Reserve still feels too distant and too aligned with financial institutions rather than working families. One more important point: the global role of the US dollar. Because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, the Federal Reserve's decisions influence not only the United States, but economies around the world. When the Fed raises interest rates, monies move into US bonds and away from foreign markets. This can create economic stress in developing countries. In a very real sense, the Federal Reserve is not just the central bank of the United States, it is a central bank of the global financial system. So, to understand economic power in America, we have to understand the Federal Reserve. It is the institution that turns the wheel of the economy. It controls money, regulates banks, influences credit, and maintains stability. It makes decisions that affect your job, your home, and your future. Yet most people rarely think about it. Most people do not even question how much power it has. So the more we understand this institution, the more clearly we can see where power really lives. And once we see that, we recognize why economic outcomes do not rise and fall on a president's words alone. This is not about criticism, it's about clarity. When we understand the real architecture of power, we become better citizens and smarter observers of public life. So now that we have covered the Federal Reserve and its roles in controlling money itself, we can shift to the institution that controls how government uses money. That institution is Congress. If the Federal Reserve shapes the flow of credit, Congress decides how that credit is collected and where it's spent. In constitutional terms, Congress holds a purse. And that is not just a ceremonial phrase, it is one of the most powerful levers in the entire system. The United States Constitution intentionally places taxing and spending authority on the legislative branch. The founders did this because they believe that the people should have a direct say in how their money is used. And the House of Representatives, elected every 2 years, was designed to reflect the public's immediate concerns. No policy becomes real until the money is behind it. Congress approves a budget, funds the military, finances social programs, and determines priorities through appropriations. The president can propose ideas, but Congress decides what gets funded. This creates a situation where the money is not only shaped by market forces and monetary policy, but also by political decisions made in committee rooms and on the congressional floor. When Congress chooses to increase spending on infrastructure, education, or science, those investments ripple into job creation, innovation, and long term growth. When Congress cuts spending or raises taxes, that can slow the economy, reduce demand, and shift financial burdens onto different groups. These choices are not just numbers on paper, they are statements about what kind of society we are building. Let us think about a concrete example. When a new highway or bridge is funded, construction companies hire workers, materials are purchased, and local businesses benefit from increased activity. That money flows through communities. On the other hand, when spending is reduced or when the government operations are shut down because Congress can't agree on a budget, paychecks are delayed. Consumer confidence drops and uncertainty spreads. Decisions made inside the Capitol affect storefronts and families thousands of miles away. There's another critical piece to Congress's authority: taxation. Taxes influence behavior. They can encourage investments in new technology through credits and deductions. They can discourage certain activities through fees or penalties. The tax code shapes business decisions, household spending, and even where companies choose to relocate. When Congress rewrites tax laws, the effects are felt in boardrooms, kitchen tables, across the country. Presidents may sign those bills, but Congress writes them. Yet, despite this immense power, many Americans do not connect their daily economic struggles or successes to Congress. They look upward to the White House instead of across the branches of government. This misunderstanding gives Congress room to act without constant public pressure. When the economy is booming, Congress may take credit quietly. When the economy is struggling, Congress may point fingers elsewhere. Accountability becomes blurred. Political incentives further complicate the picture. Members of Congress often think in shorter timelines than what the economy requires. They want visible results that they can point to before the next election. Long term investments, even if beneficial, may not win immediate voter appreciation. Meanwhile, programs that deliver short term relief with long term costs are politically attractive. The structure of Congress encourages negotiation, compromise, and sometimes gridlock. That gridlock can freeze economic policy when movement is needed most. Now, let us bring in the federal budget itself. When Congress authorizes spending that exceeds tax revenue, the government borrows the difference. That borrowed money becomes national debt. Some argue that the debt can stimulate growth when used wisely. Others warn that excessive debt risks future instability. Either way, decisions about the debt accumulation are decisions made by Congress. The president signs budgets, but Congress builds them. In recent decades, the negotiation over debt ceilings has become a recurring crisis. Debates over whether to raise limit on borrowing have become moments of brinkmanship. These confrontations create uncertainty in financial markets. Uncertainty affects investment. When the world questions whether the United States will pay its bills, borrowing costs rise. That makes everything more expensive for taxpayers. Again, these are consequences of Congress acting or not acting. There is a system of congressional committees that dig into specific areas of the economy. The House Ways and Means Committee focuses on taxes and trade. The Senate Finance Committee oversees revenue and social insurance programs. Appropriations committees decide how money is allocated across government branches or government departments. These smaller rooms are where many of the most important decisions are actually made. The public rarely watches committee hearings, but that is where the details that shape the economy are hammered out. Influence does not stop there. Congress is also a magnet for interest groups, lobbyists, and industry advocates who represent corporations, financial institutions, unions, and trade associations. These groups meet with lawmakers. They draft proposed language for bills and push for outcomes that benefit their members. Some argue that lobbying helps educate lawmakers on complex issues. Others argue it distorts democracy by giving certain groups greater access to power. Either way, lobbying influences economic outcomes every day that Congress is in session. Congress is unique in another respect. While the Federal Reserve acts with independence, Congress responds directly to public opinion, at least in theory. Members of Congress want to be reelected, and their success depends on how their constituents feel about the economy. That pressure can be positive when it motivates leaders to address real problems. It can also lead to short term thinking and reactionary policy making. The economy moves slowly. Elections come fast. That tension shapes the decisions made on Capitol Hill. A key principle in civics is that each branch of government checks the others. Congress can pass budgets, but the president can veto them. The president can propose policies, but Congress can refuse to fund them. The courts can block laws or executive actions that overstep constitutional boundaries. In economic matters, these checks sometimes produce balance. Other times they produce stalemate. When lawmakers disagree, important economic measures can get delayed or abandoned. Those delays can cost jobs and momentum. International factors also complicate the work of Congress. Global trade, supply chains, foreign investment, and geopolitical relationships influence the economy in ways no single law can fully control. Congress must legislate for a globalized economic system while responding to local economic pressures. That is a difficult balance to strike. So, where does this leave us? Congress has the constitutional authority to shape fiscal policy. It can direct resources towards national priorities. It can incentivize or discourage economic activity. It can place burdens or provide relief. And because fiscal policy affects how money moves through the real economy, through factories, small businesses, consumers, and households, Congress plays a central role in prosperity or hardship, yet Congress's role is often overlooked. We pay more attention to the branch we see most often in the news, in footage, and in press briefings, but if we want to understand the system that shapes our lives, we cannot ignore the institution with the purse in its hands. Understanding Congress's economic power gives us a better sense of who we must hold accountable. When budgets fail to serve the public or when national debt spirals upward, it reminds us that elections for lawmakers matter just as much as elections for the White House, perhaps even more, depending on the issue. Economic power in the United States is not simply commanded from behind the desk of the Oval Office. It is debated, negotiated, and bargained in the halls of Congress. And those debates affect everyday paychecks, everyday business decisions, and every federal program in our country. If the Federal Reserve manages the supply of money and Congress decides how the government spends that money, the Treasury is responsible for making sure the United States can pay its bills. The Department of Treasury is the financial operator of the federal government. It handles the real world movement of dollars, ensuring that every program funded by Congress is executed and every obligation of the United States is honored. At its core, the Treasury manages the national debt, and that debt plays a larger role in our economic system than many people realize. When Congress spends more money than the government collects in taxes, we run a deficit. To cover that deficit, the Treasury borrows money by issuing U.S. government bonds. These bonds are essentially IOUs that say the United States will repay the principal plus interest in the future. Investors around the world buy these bonds because they believe the U.S. government is stable and trustworthy. That trust matters more than almost anything else in global finance. When investors see the United States as a safe place to put their money, borrowing remains relatively cheap. Interest rates on government debt stay low, which makes debt manageable. But if confidence wavers, borrowing costs could rise. That means more tax dollars must go towards paying interest instead of funding programs or services. Treasury serves as the manager of this relationship with the world. It signals to global markets that America is stable and reliable. If investors ever stop believing that, the effects will be immediate and profound. Let us look at how this plays out. Imagine paying bills in your own household. If your lender believes you're responsible and have a secure job, you get lower interest rates. If they believe you're risky, they charge more. The same logic exists on a much larger scale for nations. Treasury must keep the United States financially credible, not just for today, but for decades into the future. Another major responsibility of the Treasury is operating the government's finances day to day. Every single paycheck issued to federal employees, every Social Security benefit, every military contract payment, every tax refund, those funds move through Treasury systems. When Congress passes a spending bill, Treasury executes the actual distribution of that money. It keeps accounts balanced and ensures that the federal government remains liquid. If Treasury cannot move the money, the government itself shuts down in practice. This is where the concept of the debt ceiling enters the picture. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on how much the United States can borrow. When the government reaches that limit, Treasury is no longer allowed to issue new debt. If spending continues without borrowing authority, Treasury may eventually run out of cash to pay obligations that are already authorized by Congress. In that scenario, bills would go unpaid. That would shake global confidence and trigger a financial crisis. These are not theoretical concerns. They have nearly happened multiple times. Debt ceiling negotiations have become high stakes political battles. But underneath the political theater is a serious structural risk. Treasury must navigate these situations carefully. It may take extraordinary measures, such as temporarily shifting funds between accounts to buy time while Congress debates. These actions are signs of stress in the system. When the world sees a country debating whether it should pay its bills, trust becomes fragile. We should also look at Treasury's role in global finance. The US dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. That means countries and corporations around the world hold dollars and dollar based assets as a form of security. International trade often happens in dollars. When Treasury manages the national debt effectively, it supports the value of the dollar. When it fails to maintain confidence, the dollar weakens, and the global financial system feels the impact. This gives the United States a unique advantage. Because the dollar is trusted, America can borrow more cheaply than most nations. That makes our economic system more resilient. It also means that decisions made by a Treasury affect not only Americans, but people and governments across the world. A Treasury policy shift can move currency markets, influence trade balances, and even contribute to geopolitical power. During crisis, Treasury collaborates with the Federal Reserve to stabilize the economy. In 2008 and in 2020, Treasury played a critical role in massive emergency programs. These programs funneled trillions of dollars into the economy to prevent collapse. They supported families, small businesses, and major industries. Treasury does not simply write checks, it helps design programs and execute them efficiently so that relief reaches where it's needed most. When markets panic, Treasury must act swiftly. That speed can prevent a crisis from spiraling into a depression. However, this emergency power raises questions. When so much money can be mobilized so quickly, who decides when and how the power is used? When debt rises rapidly, what are the long term consequences? When Treasury teams with the Federal Reserve, how much oversight still remains from Congress or the people? These questions sit at the center of modern economic governance. Another important role of Treasury is monitoring and combating financial crime and national security threats. It tracks money laundering, enforces sanctions, and protects the integrity of the financial system. Those actions can influence international relations and economic pressure campaigns. Treasury is not just a bookkeeper, it is a strategic player in global power. So, how does the public experience treasuries work? Well, often indirectly. When tax refunds arrive, when paychecks clear and when Social Security checks go out, when small businesses receive loans backed by government guarantees. Those are visible signs. But the vast majority of Treasury's influence is quiet. It is not debated nightly on cable news. It operates behind the scenes to ensure that everything keeps running. Stable function often hides its importance. When Treasury does make the news, it is usually during a moment of stress, debt ceiling conflicts, market panic, or a major economic legislation. These moments reveal just how crucial Treasury is. If Treasury miscalculates or fails to act, the repercussions would reach into every household, every company, and every local economy. The financial infrastructure of the United States would feel that hit immediately. So, what does all of this tell us about economic power? It tells us that power is not just the ability to make decisions, power is also the ability to execute those decisions successfully. Congress may decide to spend money, but Treasury makes it real. The Federal Reserve may influence the cost of borrowing, but Treasury ensures the government can borrow. The president may set priorities, but Treasury translates those priorities into solvency. The strength of the United States economy relies on confidence in Treasury's ability to keep the financial engine running. When that confidence is high, the system feels invisible. When confidence falters, we're reminded how much of our well being depends on it. Understanding Treasury's role gives us a piece of the puzzle. We have seen the power of money itself through the Federal Reserve. We have seen the power of spending and taxation through Congress. Now we see how stability and credibility are maintained through the Treasury. Without this support structure, the entire economy becomes vulnerable. And yet, for most Americans, Treasury is a distant institution. We notice the results only when something goes wrong. But if we want to understand who truly runs the U.S. economy, we cannot overlook the institution responsible for the financial lifeblood of the country. Up to this point, we have focused on government institutions, the Federal Reserve, Congress, and the Treasury. But they are not the only centers of power in the U.S. economy. In many ways, the most direct influence on people's daily lives come from the private corporations. Businesses decide where jobs are, what wages look like, what products exist, and how innovation enters the world. These decisions shape the financial reality for millions of workers and families. When most people think about the economy, they think about their personal situation, their job, their paycheck, their stability. Those things do not come from a government office. They come from businesses making millions of individual decisions every day. Corporations choose where to build factories. They choose which communities to invest in. They choose which stores to open and which stores to close. When a major employer leaves town, the economic impact is immediate and dramatic. That power is not theoretical, it is felt on the ground. Corporations also control wages. The president can talk about raising pay, and Congress can pass minimum wage laws, but most wages in America are set by private businesses responding to market competition or lack thereof. If companies decide they can reduce labor costs by automating jobs or outsourcing production overseas, those decisions reshape the workforce. Workers feel the consequences directly. Jobs disappear, communities change, and the pain lands far outside the boardroom. Now let us consider pricing. Inflation is often discussed as a national issue driven by the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. But prices themselves are set by businesses. They respond to supply and demand, yes, but they also respond to goals of the corporation profit growth, shareholder expectations, and strategic positioning. When companies feel confident consumers will pay more, they raise prices. When competition is limited in certain markets, companies have even more freedom to push prices higher. This means the cost of living is influenced not only by government policy, but by business strategy. If grocery chains adjust markups, if energy companies raise rates, if housing delivers restrict supply, families feel the impact long before Congress debates policy solutions. This is one reason why understanding corporate influence is essential to understanding economic power. Corporations make decisions with speed. They're not burdened by political gridlock. And because of that, their economic footprint is often larger and faster acting than policies that come from Washington. Corporations also drive investment and innovation. When new technologies emerge, businesses choose whether to adopt them. When breakthrough research occurs, private capital determines whether it becomes a product that consumers can buy. Innovation is the engine of wealth creation. It is also a force that can disrupt existing industries, create winners and losers. These decisions are strategic, not democratic. They follow incentives, not public opinion. It is also important to recognize how corporations influence the rules that govern them. In Washington, lobbying is a daily part of policy making. Businesses and industry groups present their arguments to lawmakers. They write proposed language for bills and advocate for regulations that favor their sectors. Some see this as a necessary expression of expertise. Others view it as an advantage that wealth uses to protect itself. Regardless, lobbying has a measurable effect on the policies that shape the economy. Corporations are central to the financial markets. When investors buy and sell stocks, they are expressing confidence or doubt in future economic performance. That affects retirement accounts, pension plans, and household wealth. Stock prices can influence how people feel about the economy, even if the underlying fundamentals remain unchanged. The market becomes a signal, a narrative people follow when evaluating their financial well being. And then we have globalization. Corporations operate across borders. They build supply chains that stretch around the world. They move production to where labor is cheaper or resources are plentiful. They seek new markets overseas. These decisions can strengthen corporate profits and lower consumer prices, but they can also weaken domestic industries and displace workers. Government policy can influence these decisions, but it cannot dictate them entirely. Corporate strategy exists on a global chessboard, while government authority has national boundaries. Now, think about the power in the sense of leverage. Corporations that employ tens of thousands of people hold leverage over local and state governments. When a company threatens to relocate, political leaders pay attention. Tax incentives and economic development deals often follow. This dynamic is part of negotiation, part of competition, and sometimes communities feel they must accept the terms offered to secure jobs and investment. In that way, corporate power shapes public decision making. Another aspect of corporate influence is control over infrastructure, not highways and bridges. Those are public, but digital infrastructure, the platforms that allow modern commerce and communication to function. Payment systems, logistic networks, cloud computing, telecommunications. Much of the architecture that supports everyday life is privately owned. When corporations control the systems people rely on, they hold power that goes beyond economics. It becomes structural, and when those systems fail or become disrupted, the effects are national. We should also talk about corporate responsibility and crisis response. During times of emergency, corporations can stabilize or destabilize the system. They decide whether to keep workers employed during downturns or make rapid cuts to preserve profits. They decide whether to raise prices in shortages or absorb losses to maintain stability. Their choices can either support national resilience or intensify hardship. Sometimes they cooperate with government efforts. Sometimes they pursue strategies that deepen divides. One more factor matters: scale. In the United States economy, a relatively small number of corporations control a significant share of the market in many industries. This concentration of power reduces competition. Fewer choices for consumers means less pressure on companies to lower prices or improve service. When economic power is concentrated, accountability becomes harder. The decisions of a few affect the consequences for many. Yet, even with all this power, corporations remain largely outside the spotlight of public accountability. The media and the political system draw attention towards elected officials. Corporations exert influence through decisions that are often treated as private business matters, even when their effects are publicly felt. Workers notice layoffs, not boardroom votes. Families see higher prices, not supply chain strategy. People experience the results without knowing the cause. So, who runs the U.S. economy? Corporations are a major part of that answer. They drive labor markets, wages, investment, prices, innovation, and global economic engagement. Their power is not granted by the Constitution, it is granted by economic scale, capital ownership, and the essential services they provide. But even corporations do not exist in isolation. Their power interacts with government power. Corporate decisions shape economic outcomes that policymakers respond to. Government actions create incentives and boundaries. That shapes corporate behavior. These forces push and pull on each other, creating the system we live in. Understanding corporations as key players in the U.S. economic structure gives us another part of the full picture. We have the Federal Reserve guiding monetary conditions, Congress directing fiscal policy, Treasury managing financial stability, and corporations driving the real economy of work, production, and consumption. Next, we will add another dimension: the role of media and technology platforms in shaping economic belief. Because the economy is not just numbers, it is also confidence. And those who shape confidence influence power in ways that we can't ignore. Now that we understand how corporations influence the real economy, there's another form of power that is equally important and far less obvious. Economic behavior does not run only on dollars and regulations, it runs on belief, confidence, and expectations, and the institutions that shape our beliefs have enormous influence over how the economy functions. This brings us to media and technology platforms. When people talk about the economy, they rarely talk about real numbers and spreadsheets. They talk about how they feel. Do they feel secure? Do they feel like prices are rising too fast? Do they feel or do they believe that their job is stable? Do they think the country is moving in the right direction? Those feelings drive decisions, investment choices, and even political involvement. Media shapes those feelings. When a news headline announces that inflation is rising, people become more cautious with their money. When the stock market drops and reporters call it a crash, even if the decline is temporary, people panic. When unemployment numbers are strong and presented as a sign of growth, consumers might feel more confident buying a home or starting a business. In this way, the economy becomes partly psychological. Media sets the tone of that psychology. Consider the stock market. While it is not the whole economy, many people treat it as a signal for economic health. When financial news programs show markets failing, fear spreads rapidly. Investors sell shares, retirement accounts shrink. The emotional response amplifies the financial impact, and that amplification is possible because information moves fast. Now imagine that same dynamic applying to everything from pandemic fears to banking stability to expectations of future growth. Media plays a crucial role in shaping the narrative around all of these topics. Narratives become beliefs, beliefs become behavior, behavior becomes economic reality. Technology has only made this more powerful. Social media platforms deliver constant streams of content designed to capture attention and trigger emotional responses. Short videos, headlines, and trending topics are not designed necessarily to inform, they are designed to engage. When people become anxious or outraged, they click more. The algorithm rewards that spreads quickest, not what is the most accurate. And this creates a new form of economic power: attention control. Tech companies run digital ecosystems where billions of decisions are influenced quietly: what people buy, what topics they care about, what trends shape consumption, what causes fear or confidence, what products go viral, what opinions become normal. An online rumor about bank failures can cause people to withdraw their money. A wave of excitement about a new product can generate explosive demand. News stories about job losses in one sector can make people fear instability across the whole economy. All of these examples show how fast belief can reshape financial reality. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram are not just entertainment tools, they are part of the infrastructure's public opinion. They can focus national attention on a single issue or bury one that would otherwise spark oversight and accountability. Their influence is not limited to consumer behavior, it reaches into democracy itself. At the root, economic power depends on what people think will happen next. Media directs that thinking, technology amplifies it. We should also consider advertising. Corporations spend billions every year to influence consumer choices. Ads persuade people to buy things that they do not need. They shape cultural values around spending, luxury, and identity. When an entire society is encouraged to seek fulfillment through consumption, purchasing becomes a habit. That habit fuels economic growth, but can also drive debt, stress, and vulnerability. Financial media plays a role too. Investment news often creates a self reinforcing cycle. If analysts predict a rise in a market, investors buy in, and the prediction becomes true. If they warn about downturns, investors retreat and downturns intensify. It is a loop. Media shapes expectation, expectation shapes behavior, behavior shapes outcome. This influence is subtle because it does not look like power. It looks like information. It looks like entertainment. Yet it can move markets more effectively than policies written in Congress. It can reshape consumer confidence faster than the Federal Reserve can adjust interest rates. It can shift cultural attitudes in ways that Treasury cannot measure. There's also the issue of credibility. People trust certain news sources and influencers more than others. If those sources provide misleading or overly simplified information, millions may base economic decisions on false assumptions. When misinformation spreads, it does not just harm public understanding, it harms economic stability. We saw this in the pandemic. Supply shortages were real, but panic buying made them far worse. People saw empty shelves online, and fear spread faster than the virus. That fear created real economic phenomena: price spikes, product scarcity, transportation bottlenecks. A narrative became a crisis. Another example is cryptocurrency. Social media hype created a belief that digital coins would replace traditional money. That belief led to massive financial speculation. When confidence collapsed, billions in value disappeared within days. Those losses affected real people. Savings wiped out, plans delayed, trust damaged. This is the power of information and motion. Let's also talk about tech platform control. Algorithms decide who sees what, when they see it, how often they see it. That means private companies influence what economic issues feel urgent, which narrative becomes popular, which solutions appear legitimate. This is the new category of power, not governmental authority, not economic ownership, power over belief. The economy is not just built on resources and labor, it's built on trust. Trust in currency, trust in banking, trust in markets, trust in government decision. If that trust breaks, the system breaks. Those who shape trust shape power. Media and technology companies are part of the architecture of the U.S. economy, whether we acknowledge it or not. They do not write laws. They do not set interest rates. They don't directly create jobs. Instead, they shape the environment in which all those decisions happen. They move public perception, which moves public behavior, which moves markets. So when we ask who runs the US economy, we need to include those who move money, those who allocate money, those who ensure stability, those who produce goods and jobs, and those who shape belief about all of the above. Media is a tech sit in and that last category. It's power without a ballot, influence without election, control without formal authority. They can elevate truth or distort it. They can strengthen trust or fracture it. And because the economy responds to confidence, their role is central. Understanding media and tech influence allows us to see the economy in a fuller dimension, not just numbers and policies, but information and emotion. It helps us recognize that the story we hear about the economy is not always the full story. There may be deeper forces beneath the headlines. As citizens, if we want to interpret the system correctly, we must understand the storytellers who frame how the system is described. Sometimes the narrative reflects reality. Sometimes the narrative reshapes reality. That is economic power operating through communication, not command. This brings us to the final institution we will discuss in this episode, the administrative state, a complex network of agencies and officials who execute and enforce the rules of the economy daily. Their influence does not come from visibility, it comes from permanence and process. And we rarely see them operate, and though they shape outcomes that we feel every day. We have talked about the Federal Reserve, Congress, Treasury, corporations, and media. All of these institutions influence the U.S. economy in big and visible ways. But there's another center of power that many Americans never think about, even though it shapes daily life in significant ways. That power sits in administrative state, sometimes called the federal bureaucracy. When most people hear the word bureaucracy, they think of inefficiency, paperwork, long waits at government offices. But bureaucracy is in the United States and it does far more than process forms. It interprets, implements, and enforces the rules that govern the economy. It turns broad laws into specific actions. It manages programs that affect millions of people. It provides the expertise that elected officials rely on. In other words, the administrative state makes the system work. To understand its importance, think of government power as a flow. Congress writes laws, the president signs them, but laws do not enforce themselves. They require detailed policies, oversight, and continuous adjustments to keep up with changing conditions. Agencies are the ones who do that work. They draft regulations, inspect compliance, gather data, and apply penalties when needed. Without these steps, Laws will be little more than words on paper. Consider the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC. This agency regulates financial markets. It monitors trade to prevent fraud and market manipulation. When major corporations issue stock or merge with others, the SEC reviews the details. These actions do not appear on nightly news, but they protect investors and maintain fair markets. If the SEC fails, confidence in the financial system can crumble quickly. Or think about the Department of Labor. It enforces workplace safety standards, oversees wage laws, and tracks employment trends. When a worker goes home safe at the end of a long shift or receives a fair paycheck, that is the result of rules written and enforced by an agency. Other examples include the Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates emissions and pollution that can affect public health and industry costs. The Department of Commerce influences trade policies and business growth. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau guards consumers against abusive lending practices. This list extends far and wide. Every one of these agencies touch the economy. What makes the administrative state powerful is not political drama, it is continuity. Senators and representatives serve limited terms. Presidents come and go. But career officials in these agencies often remain in place for decades. They have institutional memory. They understand complexities of the system that can take years to learn. They advise incoming leaders. They apply laws consistently across transitions. Their knowledge becomes foundational to how the economy functions. This stability is intentionally built into the system. The founders did not want every shift in public opinion to cause the entire structure to tilt wildly. Bureaucratic continuity helps maintain economic order when politics become unpredictable. But that stability also means the agencies can accumulate influence that is difficult for elected officials to fully control. Some critics argue that the administrative state has grown too powerful, creating what they call a fourth branch of government. These critics say agencies sometimes make rules that have the force of law without enough direct democratic oversight. Supporters counter that modern economies are too complex for lawmakers alone to manage. They argue that expert judgment is necessary to protect consumers, maintain markets, and keep the country competitive. Both views contain some truth. A good example of this dynamic is regulatory rulemaking. When Congress writes a law about banking, it rarely includes every detail. Instead, it gives agencies authority to fill in the specifics. Those specifics can shape how banks operate, how credit flows, and what risks are allowed. Agencies hold public comment periods and consult experts, but in the end, they write the terms that become enforceable rules. And enforcement matters. A rule that exists only on paper has no effect. Agencies inspect companies, issue fines, revoke licenses, and pursue legal action when necessary. That enforcement encourages compliance and helps maintain fair competition. The system relies on this constant watchfulness. We see power or agency power clearly during crisis. When the economy struggles, agencies implement relief programs, support industries, and maintain public services. During the pandemic, agencies coordinated unemployment support, small business loans, health protections, and supply chain monitoring. Technical expertise mattered more than political speeches. Millions relied on the administrative state to stay afloat. Another point to consider is how agencies gather information. They continuously monitor employment data, environmental conditions, consumer behavior, and economic performance. This data shapes policy decisions. When the economy begins to shift direction, agencies often see those changes first. They alert leaders to problems developing beneath the surface. The president and Congress depend on that insight. And then there's the issue of complexity. Modern economies involve technology, finance, and logistics that require deep knowledge to manage properly. No elected official can master every topic. Agencies hire specialists, engineers, economics, scientists, analysts who provide expertise. Without them, policymaking will become guesswork. With all this influence comes a challenge: transparency. Most Americans do not know how or what these agencies are doing day to day. Their work is rarely shown on television or trending online. When the administrative state functions well, it goes unnoticed. But when mistakes occur or accountability lapses, the consequences can be significant. Here's a key reality: executive agencies translate economic authority into real world impact. Congress decides what should happen. The president supports those decisions. But the administrative state decides how it happens. That how can determine whether a law succeeds, fails, or creates unintended consequences. Implementation is power. The administrative state also connects public and private sectors. Businesses must comply with rules, report data, and adjust behavior based on agency decisions. Agencies, in turn, rely on business cooperation to keep the system functioning. This cooperation creates a feedback loop that influences how both entities operate. Governance and commerce become intertwined. So, what does this mean for our central question? Who actually runs the U.S. economy? The administrative state represents the operational power of economic governance. Bureaucrats write detailed rules, inspectors enforce standards, analysts track performance, agencies adapt processes, experts guide leadership. This power may not appear in headlines, it may not be debated in political rallies, but it exists in every paycheck, every regulation, every price tag, and every economic statistic the public sees. It's a quiet power, a permanent power, a power that does not depend on election cycles. And because of that, it can either help maintain stability or drift away from public accountability if not carefully overseen. Understanding the administrative state reveals the deeper machinery of American economic life. It shows us that leadership is not only about direction, it's about execution. When you realize how much of the economic system is governed not by politicians, but by career professionals working behind the scenes, the idea of a single leader running the economy becomes even more realistic. With this understanding, we can now put all the pieces together. How networked power across these institutions forms the true architecture of economic control in the United States. Now that we've built a complete picture of how power moves through the U.S. economy, the question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? Understanding economic power isn't just about learning facts, it's about reclaiming the ability to interpret the world around us. When people do not understand who actually makes decisions, frustration grows. They blame the wrong leaders. They demand solutions from institutions that do not control the levers that they care about. They become vulnerable to misinformation, finger pointing, and political manipulation. If you think one person runs the economy, you will constantly feel betrayed. If you understand the system, you can ask better questions. You can question why Congress prioritizes some spending and not others. You can evaluate whether the Federal Reserve's decisions match conditions you see in your community. You can understand if corporate policies align with the public good. You can follow whether media narratives match real economic data. You can track how agencies enforce rules and whether oversight is effective. This knowledge gives citizens power: power to hold the right institutions accountable, power to engage meaningfully in a democracy, power to see beyond slogans and sound bites, Power to interpret reality instead of inheriting someone else's version of it. Economic decisions shape the world we live in. They determine whether people can start families, afford homes, retire securely, or invest in education. They influence whether a town thrives or declines, whether a generation feels hopeful or anxious. And those decisions are not random. They come from structures that we can study, understand, and evaluate. Knowing how the system works makes you harder to manipulate. It makes you a more informed participant in shaping the future. The United States was built on the idea that the people are the sovereign power. But sovereignty only works if the people understand the system they live in. Without that understanding, citizens become spectators instead of stakeholders. Democracy becomes performance instead of participation, and power shifts quietly to those who understand the system better than anyone else. This show exists to help change that dynamic. We're going to break down every part of how this country functions, how laws are written, how institutions operate, how money moves, how power is exercised. Not for one party or one ideology, not for fear or outrage, but for clarity, because clarity is empowering. The more we understand the real architecture behind American governance and economics, the more confident we can be in engaging with it, and the harder it becomes for any institution to operate without accountability. Hey, y'all, this has been the Harold Robinson Analysis: History, Economics, Power. Subscribe if you want to understand the system you live in. I'll see y'all next time.